Cuba. And as has become the norm over the past 2 months, it's Nikki and Keith here from Rockjumper, and we are very pleased to see so many of you zooming in with us once again. I believe that most of you are now Zoom experts and have a great handle on how it all works, but if this is your first webinar with us and you'd like to ask a question, please just use the chat function or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We love hearing from you, and we also love fielding your questions, so please feel free to ask away. We may not be able to answer all of them live, but we'll do our level best. So this week, Nikki and I are joined by a good friend and colleague, Clayton Burne, who's going to showcase Cuba, a rather misunderstood place in many ways, with an interesting history to boot. The island has been off the radar for many birders, especially people from the US. However, some incredible birding opportunities await, and thankfully, visiting from the US is no longer an issue. From a birding perspective, it's probably most famous for holding the world's smallest bird, minuscule bee hummingbird, and for also being one of the last places where the much loved and widely publicized ivory-billed woodpecker was found. So as I touched on earlier, tonight's guest speaker is Rockjumper's operations manager, Clayton Burne. He's an extremely analytical person, an independent thinker, logical, disciplined, and has a real gift for solving complex logistics and problems. These traits have all stood him in excellent stead in his position, which he has now held for almost 6 years, and he plays an integral role within our management team. Clayton's also traveled extensively across the planet and has spent volumes of time exploring the continents of Africa, Asia, Europe, the New Guinean part of Australasia, and especially South and Central America, where he took a year out of his life to bicycle and motorbike across this incredible part of the world. Whilst he was doing that, he covered 7 different countries in the process. Clayton was also kind enough to send me some of his personal stats from that particular trip, which make for some very interesting reading indeed. Total birds seen and remember this is bicycle and motorbike and what have you, total birds seen 1,628 species, a total of 55 different mammals, and he covered a total distance of over 31,000 kilometers, which is close to 19,250 miles. Some pretty incredible numbers there, and what an experience. So to be even more specific and relevant to tonight's webinar, Clayton spent many months as well traveling through not only Cuba, but the Greater Cinders as a whole. And tonight he's going to be sharing his wealth of experience with all of you. On that note, I'd like to hand over to Clayton.
Thanks very much, Keith. We'll just get back onto the right side of the continent. I've traversed the Greater Antilles quite a lot, so I've not done much of the Greater Cinders.
Oh dear, that's a total slip of the tongue on my part. Absolutely.
That's Asian persuasion, right? All right, let's get going. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this evening's webinar on Cuba from me. I think to start off with, we'll jump right in with what is probably the image that first enters everyone's mind when they think of Cuba, and that is, love him or hate him, Ernesto Che Guevara. And I want to pause just for thought here. This is a country that was discovered by Europeans at least more than 520 years ago. And it's slightly ironic that it's an Argentine who spent less than a decade of his life in Cuba that provides the most potent symbol for the country. Now, we could spend hours talking about Che and as could any Cuban, but we'll come back to him a little bit later and the impact that he and other revolutionaries had on the country. We'll move on, get ourselves ready for what we're going to cover tonight. Obviously, we're going to cover quite a few birds, but I'm also going to touch on some of the things that you're likely to see while we're there. Historical sites, some of the other touristic facilities, a bit of the modern history, which makes Cuba quite interesting. Some of the classic automobiles that are still to be found there, and this trio of revolutionaries that everyone knows so much about. But to frame this correctly, let's start off with a bit of geography. Cuba is a fairly large island, about 110,000 square kilometers. It makes it the 8th largest island of the world. And if you want to consider it from an American perspective or US perspective, it's roughly the size of Nevada. What everyone does know is it's awfully close to the United States. It's roughly 90 miles to the south of Florida. And geologically, it is part of the Greater Antilles, which are a number of the large islands that you can see on this map. Cuba is therefore part of, alongside Jamaica, Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, and the Bahamas. And the island of Hispaniola is split up between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Moving on from geography, let's have a look at what happened before Europeans arrived. In the map that you can see there, you've got what was modern day representation of how people were populated in the Greater Antilles before just about the time of Christopher Columbus's arrival. The majority of the Greater Antilles were populated by the Taino people, who originated from the Arawaks in Venezuela. They moved their way across the Lesser Antilles, island hopping into the Greater Antilles, and became the dominant force in these islands until Columbus arrived. Now, as most of us know, the Italian explorer Columbus pitched up in the Caribbean. On the 28th of October 1492, he discovered Cuba, believing that he had discovered the East Indies. But quite naturally, he declared Cuba a colony of Spain. Within a century of Columbus's arrival, the Taino were extinct. That is a combination of forced labor, warfare, smallpox, decimated the population to the point where no one was certain that any Taino were left. But recently, DNA statistics have, or studies have shown that there's quite a large population of people on these islands that still have, or are genetically Taino to some extent. Cuba didn't have a whole lot happen to it over the years since the loss of all the Taino. It was fairly static for a while until 1762, when the British sacked Havana. Spain ceded Havana to the British. And then the British traded it back to the Spanish within the year, taking Florida in place of Cuba. And again, we went through about 130 years before anything interesting happened again. The first, shall we say, Cuban revolutionaries that were inspired by Jose Marti were very close to winning sort of independence from Spain at their third attempt. When the United States got involved to help push them across the line, got involved with the War of Spain. And not only did the United States take Cuba, they also got Puerto Rico and the Philippines at the same time. Now, Cuba wasn't taken by the US as a colony or a state. It was very much a protectorate. And to prove that that's what the United States wanted, they felt that it was necessary to build a naval base on the southeastern corner of Cuba called Guantanamo. And that's how things stood at the turn of last century. A couple of inanimate images here that probably don't have much bearing for anyone just yet, but I'll explain them now. So 50 years of American protection over Cuba had resulted in a couple of democratic elections, as you could call them, until 1952, when one of the former presidents, Batista, took part in a coup and took over the country. Clearly, a couple of people were quite upset with Batista taking control of the country. They obviously didn't like his presidency from before, and they attempted to I don't even know, they didn't try to kill him, but they mounted a coup of their own at the Moncada barracks on the 26th of July, 1953, for which both Fidel and Raul Castro were put in prison. Inexplicably, Batista let them out of prison after 2 years, and they exiled themselves to Mexico, which is quite possibly the greatest mistake that Batista made, because in Mexico they met one Che Guevara. And as most of us have a rudimentary history of this, the two Castro brothers and Che Guevara, along with about 79 other revolutionaries, left Mexico on a boat at the top right of the screen there called the Granma. Traveled to Cuba, were found by the Cuban military. Near enough half of them were shot and killed on sight. A few of them managed to escape, including the Castro brothers and Guevara, into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. And from that small beginning, they took over Cuba in just over 2 years. From 40-odd individuals in November 1956 that survived the original landing on Cuba until January 1st, 1959, when Batista fled Cuba, and that was the end of the Cuban Revolution. The United States instituted a trade embargo in 1960, which is still in place to this day. And I think for the majority of people watching this, will be very well aware of what happened not long after that, when the Russians attempted to put nuclear missiles on Cuba. And we came probably as close as the Earth has ever come to destroy, mutually assured destruction by nuclear weapons. Anyway, we'll come back to that in some later point. Interestingly, Guantanamo Bay is still operated by the United States. They pay rent for it, as they have done since Guantanamo was created. The rent is $4,085 per year. Cuba has only ever cashed one check by mistake. The rest have been stuffed in a desk drawer in Fidel Castro's office. I don't know what's happened in recent years since Fidel died, but I imagine the rest of the checks are still there too. All right, so we've all genned up a little bit on Cuba. We know the history, we know where it is, we bought our ticket and we've flown to Cuba. The question now is, what are we going to see when we get there? Cuba is quite a fascinating country to arrive in, and I can only say in so many terms, it's like moving backwards in time, working yourself into a living history. The trade embargo that the United States has put on Cuba hasn't just stopped American companies trading with Cuba, but it's stopped any company in the world that has a global footprint from trading with Cuba under penalty of not being allowed to trade with the United States. So very little makes its way into Cuba. So when you arrive, you're going to find a country that, for the best part, is still stuck in the late 1950s. And while this is obviously very difficult for the Cuban people themselves, it's one of the standout attractions that people have to Cuba, to be able to go back and see what, I guess, what society was like 50, 60 years ago. And this is what you're going to see when you come out of the airport and you drive into town, and depending on where you're staying and how you view the city. But you're going to find a city which hasn't had a huge amount of structural development. There has been a lot of renovations in the last, say, 10 to 15 years since the tourism has really started kicking off there. But most of the restoration is focused on old buildings that are being restored to their former glory, rather than the building of new ones. There are indeed some modern buildings in Cuba. These are mostly chain hotels that have been invested and built between the Cuban governments and foreign chain investors. So the top left there is downtown Havana, with the Malecon on the left-hand side, which runs along the coast. The Malecon was built to protect the city from the ocean. It's a huge esplanade with great big, I don't know if you can put it, a great big wall that is locally known as the Sofa. It's an area of great social interaction. Then moving in a clockwise direction, you've got El Capitolio, and which I guess to most people looks very similar to the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's not based on that. In fact, it's based on the Pantheon in Paris. But as it happens, El Capitolio is 1 meter taller, 1 meter wider, and 1 meter longer than the US Capitol. And you sort of suspect that's not a coincidence. And then you have right at the bottom right, easily the ugliest building in all of Cuba is the Russian embassy. It's awfully efficient, not very pretty. And these are standout features that you will see without too much effort traveling around Havana. Now, hopefully you've arrived a day or so before your birding tour is about to begin, because you could really do with a few days in Havana. It's got such a wealth of places to explore that even a couple of days isn't really long enough. But to get the best out of most of it, give yourself a day or two. The top left image here you can see is Morro Castle, which overlooks the entrance to the harbor. The top right-hand image is the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. It's a fairly infamous site. It was the host of the Havana conference, which was a mobster conference of the New York and New Jersey mob families that was attended by the likes of Lucky Luciano, Mayalansky, Santo Traficante, and various other gangsters. Moving downwards, that red and black contraption was a homemade tank, which is on display at the Museo de la Revolución. It's a tractor with some metal welded around it to protect people on the inside. That was used in the revolution. And then bottom left is one of the many military artifacts that are on the outside of the museum, covering various parts of history, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. And indeed, that particular image there is on the below right left-hand side is an engine from an aircraft flown by an American pilot that was shot down during the Bay of Pigs invasion that was denied ever having existed until very recently. And then to go inside the Museo de Revolución itself is absolutely breathtaking. You could spend ages inside here just looking at the intricacies of the internal part of this museum. It was decorated by Tiffany's of New York, and indeed even has the bullet holes of an unsuccessful 1957 assassination against Batista. They're still there, and you can see those when you go inside. And while you're walking around Havana, have a look out for these cars. Again, due to the economic embargo, Cubans couldn't really do a whole lot in terms of importation of vehicles, and they certainly couldn't get parts for these American cars. So they had to make do with what they had, and have done up until fairly recently, I think. The Russians have flooded Cuba with larders. There's no photos of those because they're not attractive. They're certainly not good to look at, and they don't get maintained very well. I took these photos in my first trip to Cuba in 2008, and it was fairly common to see these vintage vehicles all over the show, driven by locals for general transport. They were a fairly common sight in Havana and pretty much across the island. In my last tours to Cuba in 2014 and 2015, these had diminished quite drastically, and it actually took a while to find vintage cars because they're now kept almost exclusively for tourism rides and for tourist areas. So tragically, these cars are diminishing quite quickly now that Cuba has access to cheaper foreign cars. There's quite a few Japanese vehicles there now. And while you're walking around Havana having a look at history and culture, you're likely to find red-legged thrush. It's a fairly common bird on the island. It is restricted. It's a Greater Antillean endemic. And this bird in particular that we're looking at here, if you look at its belly, it's got a bit of a rufusy orange belly. It's quite different to the one that you find on Hispaniola, and is probably likely to be split. So if you've seen this bird in both Cuba and Dominican Republic, or if you venture to Haiti, you might get an armchair tick here in the future. Okay, we're about to start the tour. So the first thing we're going to do over dinner is discuss how does Cuba fit into the rest of the Greater Antilles. And we'll just run through a couple of quick numbers to give you an idea of the volume of endemics that each island has, as well as what endemic families they possess. So Cuba has 29 political endemics. There are a lot of Cuban species that are also near endemics with the Bahamas. So the number of endemics and near endemics is nearly double that. Jamaica has 28, Hispaniola itself as an island has 29, and Puerto Rico has 16. And all the Greater Antillean islands have representatives of at least one or two of the families, of the 6 families that are endemic to the Caribbean. Only Jamaica doesn't have a completely endemic family. Okay, so we've gone through the history. It's time to start the tour. We're going to have breakfast in Havana on our first day, and then we're going to start making our way west into the province of Pinar del Rio. We will stop initially to look at some large water bodies, get a few ducks and wetland species to pad the list to start with, before the birding proper starts. And the first majorly significant birding area we're going to come to is this place called Las Terrazas. The site was originally a terraced area was terraced by the French Haitians to grow coffee. The coffee attempt was a spectacular failure, and shortly after that, logging commenced in earnest, and by the mid-1960s, there was not a single tree on any of those hills. They were flattened, terraced, and had nothing to show for them. Fidel Castro put a large effort into, determined effort into reforesting some sections of the country. This was one of them. Today, Las Terrazas is about 5,000 hectares of solid secondary forest. Don't quote me on this, but I believe 4 million individual trees were planted over a period of time to get the place to this location. And aside from being just a really good success story of how you can rework a destroyed environment, Las Terrazas is one of the best places for us to see this bird, Cuban grassquit. As you can imagine, small seed-eating bird that's that pretty is popular amongst the cage bird fraternity. And indeed, the reason that this bird is diminishing over much of its range is for the cage bird trade. Las Terrazas itself, being the kind of area, and it is environmentally orientated, has a good safe haven for the species. And we normally see fairly decent numbers, including a couple of decent looking males like this. It's also going to be the place that we're going to start seeing some of the really standout Cuban endemics, including the national bird, Cuban trogon, or the onomatopoeically known tocororo. It sports the colors of the Cuban flag. It's fairly common. It's widespread across the island. If you're going to have a national bird, you're going to do well to have a better one than this. And just because it is such a good-looking bird, I thought we'd have 2 views. So Cuban trogon is common, as I say, and we'll see it in the various numbers of locations. They're quite photogenic. But probably the next bird is the one that causes the most oohs and ahs whenever we find one. They are extraordinarily cute. Cuban toady. There's 5 species of toady across the Greater Antilles. Cuba has this one. It is the brightest of the toadies. It can be quite abundant. Some locations we'll see multiple flocks or pairs of them moving around. They can be very confiding as well, often allowing you to get quite close and get video footage of them and really good photos. And then a number of other endemics can be found early on here at Las Terrazas as well, including Cuban green woodpecker, which is easily the commonest woodpecker on the island. Las Sagres flycatcher, which fortunately is the only Mayakas flycatcher on the island, so we don't have to spend a huge effort in trying to ID the bird. It was named after Don Ramon de la Sagra, a former director of Havana's botanical gardens. And another fairly drab species, the Cuban peewee, or the crescent-eyed peewee. It's got this white crescent behind the eye that makes it easily identifiable. And aside from the Cuban endemics and near endemics, there's a number of US migratory New World warblers, including American redstart that start arriving in Cuba around August, September, and they stick around until April, May. They can be quite common, as can northern parula, which arrives in Cuba around September and departs about in April. You have western spandalis, which is restricted to Cuba, but can also be seen off, I think it's in Cancun, Mexico. It used to be part of what was better known as the stripe-headed tanager complex, which has now been split into 4 species. You can find this one obviously in Cuba, and then you've got one on Jamaica, Hispaniola, and in Puerto Rico. We'll see a lot of this bird, Cuban blackbird. It's fairly difficult to get a decent photo of a pitch black bird. They're known locally as the toti. They're abundant across the island. And we'll also see tawny-shouldered blackbird, which looks very similar, but it does have a tawny shoulder. And once we've spent the morning at Las Terrazas, we'll start moving further west. We sometimes stop here at the Cordillera de Guanaguanico. This is the mountain range in western Cuba that incorporates the Viñales Valley and the famous Cueva de los Portales. This is the Cueva de los Portales. There's 2 images there. On the left is the best I could do from the dark depths of the cave, the steps that go out. And the top right of the cave, you can see this breeze block building there. Now, the breeze block building was occupied by Che Guevara during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His Western Army was stationed here in case the US invaded from the west. As it happened, Guevara spent a lot of time playing chess and saw no action whatsoever. His chessboard and bed and chair and desk are still in this building as they were. And aside from that, the other reason that we really come here is to see this bird, the Cuban solitaire, extraordinary songster. They will certainly be heard before we see one. But with a little bit of effort, we'll normally find a couple of them perched up, much like above. And we'll also look for great lizard cuckoo, which can be seen at numerous sites across the island, and the very attractive yellow-headed warbler. This is one part of 2 birds that make up the endemic Cuban warbler family. It's frequently found in small flocks, often with Cuban vireo. Then, after having successfully seen all the endemics that we need to see on the western half of Cuba, we'll start making our way to the famous Ciénaga de Zapata. It's a fairly long drive, which will be broken up with the odd birding stop. But as we start getting towards the Zapata swamp, as it is in English, we're going to come to a town called Australia. And yes, it really is called Australia. It's a small hamlet that we pass through on the way to Playa Giron. It gets its name from the local sugar mill. Other sugar mills in the area were also named after continents. And the reason it's semi-famous, at least, is that this was Fidel Castro's base of operations during the Bay of Pigs invasion. And this is a very small museum, has a couple of old steam trains that were used to transport sugarcane. Once we pass through Australia, we are then going to be struck by a lot of history, particularly around the Bay of Pigs invasion, or the Playa Giron invasion, as the Cubans call it. And we're going to see numerous signs. The sign at the top right is the last, or the furthest that the mercenarios, as they were called, managed to make it. The concrete grave at the bottom left has been constructed for every single Cuban that died in the battle. And we'll see numerous of these graves all along the road down to Playa Larga and Playa Giron. And as we continue further towards the Bay of Pigs, we're going to stop. This is where we'll probably overnight in this town of Playa Giron. Has a gorgeous museum with a couple of tanks, some planes, and plenty of history on the inside. It's more commonly known to the rest of the world as the Bay of Pigs invasion, but as I say, the Cubans called it the Battle of Giron. A couple of shots of the Zapata Peninsula, fairly tranquil bay. Another picture of Castro standing and directing his troops. It's actually very difficult to find pictures of Fidel Castro anywhere in Cuba, so when you do, you take them. And this area of Cuba is perhaps the most interesting from us, or for us from our perspective as birders, because the majority of the endemics can be seen in this area. And without doubt, one of the prime reasons for coming to Cuba is to see this fellow, the world's smallest bird, just about. He's only slightly smaller than the vervain hummingbird of Hispaniola in Jamaica. It's very difficult to put it into perspective of just how small this bird is until you actually see it. But if you can imagine, from the tip of his tail to the tip of that bill can be as little as 5 centimeters and only weigh 1.6 grams. They're quite localized birds. We tend only to find them in the Zapata area. But I'm going to show you another photo just to give you a better idea of scale. That's a lady's hand for scale. A lot of other birds to be seen in the area, including Cuban emerald. It's a common and widespread hummingbird on the island. It's known locally as zun zun. It's probably onomatopoeic for the wing-beated sound it makes. But one of the most attractive birds that I really wanted to see beyond just bee hummingbird was this fellow, the blue-headed quail dove. I'd say it's one of the top 3 most sought-after Cuban endemics. Interestingly, it's a monotypic species that has more in common with Australasian doves than it does with other quail doves. It's quite endangered, and it's certainly one of the trickier species to find on the island. Some tours you get this easily at a hide, other times you have to walk to find it. But we have a couple of locations for it. And when you do connect with this bird, not only can you get photos like this, but you can get photos like this. As I say, blue-headed quail dove's gorgeous bird, but there are more quail doves than that on the island. There's actually 4, 3 of which we see regularly. This is the grey-fronted quail dove. It was fairly recently split from the conspecific white-fronted quail dove on Hispaniola. It's also quite rare and localized. And again, normally we get it from a purpose-built hide. We move into the palm stands and we search for bare-legged owl, or what used to be known as Cuban screech owl. And the way we do this is the local guides tend to know which of the palm stands is being used each year by these guys. And we walk up, stand outside it, and the local guide will walk up to the trunk and give it a few taps, and a little head will pop out. And that, generally speaking, is the kind of view you get of this bird. If you're very lucky, you get this view of the birds, when a whole family of them pops out. Have a look at you. We also do very well with Stygian owl. It's an incredibly widespread bird throughout the New World, but it's nowhere easy anywhere. Our success rate in Cuba is actually very good. We've seen this bird on 90% of the tours that we've done. Zapata is also the stronghold for Fernandina's flicker. It's another of the highly sought after endemics. There's perhaps 300 pairs of this bird left, most of which occur on the Zapata Peninsula only. And northern flicker. It's obviously a common bird in the United States, but this particular race of the bird, the subspecies on Cuba, is quite distinctive, and it could be a split in the future. So it's always good to make sure you see this one. Zapata wren, which is also confined to the Zapata Peninsula. It's a bird that's definitely more often heard than seen. Every now and then, you get an unexpected view. This image that was taken by my colleague Dushan probably only happens every 4 or 5 tours, if you're lucky. I've personally had the bird run past my boot on the ground when we didn't see it until it had already gone past. We weren't looking that low down. But it can be a tricky bird to see. It's very poorly known. Its taxonomic affinities are not understood very well. And red-shouldered blackbird. I know many of you at home are shouting red-winged blackbird. It is not. It's a red shoulder. Although it looks almost identical to the red-winged blackbird of the United States and North America, it's different by the females. The females are not streaked in brown. They're actually pitch black. And unlike the red-wings, pairs of red-shouldered blackbird duet. They feed their young together. They're monogamous, which is in quite a significant contrast to the polygynous red-wings. This can also be quite a difficult bird to see. Normally, we have to spend a bit of time, put some effort in to find this bird. Zapata sparrow. It's probably better known as the Cuban sparrow. It's not restricted to the Zapata Peninsula as was once thought. There's actually 3 very distinct populations on the island. We normally see this one in the Zapata Peninsula, and we see the other population around the northern Keys of Coco. There's another population in the east that we don't see. We can normally see Cuban nightjar during the day, on a day roost, but if not, it normally takes us a couple of minutes in the early evening, and then they come out and they start working the sort of bare roads. We can get good views and pretty close to these birds. Cuban pygmy owl, common diurnal species that we will see at most places. And the Cuban bullfinch. And while it's also found in the Bahamas, there's a good possibility that the Bahamian subspecies and the Cuban subspecies are actually quite different and might be split. So again, it's another good bird that we need to find. We're actually quite likely to see this bird kept by Cubans in little cages outside their houses at numerous places. It's a very popular bird in the cage bird trade, and having quite a significant impact on its natural population. Aside from the endemics, we'll also see some fantastic water birds along the Salinas marshes. This is American flamingo, which can often be in very large numbers. Reddish egret, which is one of at least 10 different species of herons that we see on most tours. And not only do we see 10 different herons, but quite often we see their typical and their white morphs of all the dimorphic herons. And I'm sure the best part for some of you, snakes and reptiles. There's a couple of species of anole that I've taken photos of. There's actually quite a lot. There's about 140 reptiles in Cuba. About 80% of them are endemic. The few snakes that are there are not venomous. They pose no threat to humans, other than stink. This photo on the right of myself holding a Cuban racer was taken one of my guests, Sherry, a tour in 2015. She could probably testify to the fact that when you catch the snake, it defecates a horrid odor to you that doesn't come off for a few weeks. And after 3 days on the Zapata Peninsula, we start moving further east. We depart Playa Girón and make our way to Santa Clara, key city in the Revolution. And then further south to where we overnight in the town of Camagüey. And that does look like a very long distance, and indeed it's a long travel day, but it's a flat and straight road. It's not particularly taxing. We will make a stop, obviously, in Santa Clara to take in some of the revolutionary feel. Santa Clara was chosen as the best location to pay homage to Guevara due to his success at the Battle of Santa Clara. That was the final battle that finalized the Cuban Revolution when he won victory or got victory here. and Batista fleeing into exile the very next day. Here's another picture of Guevara and on the mausoleum. Guevara was, again, as perhaps many of you know, he was killed at quite a young age in Bolivia, and his body was lost for 30 years. It was hidden in an unmarked grave. It was rediscovered in October 1997, about 30 years after he was executed, and his remains were returned from Bolivia and interred here. The reason that we head so far east on the island is to get to the small village area of Nahasa. We look for a couple of key species here, including this one, the giant kingbird. It's becoming increasingly rare. Nests almost exclusively in very tall kyber trees. And when you look in the guidebook, you're going to look at this bird and you're going to look at the next one, logger-headed kingbird, and think those two species look pretty difficult to tell apart. And indeed, until you've actually seen a giant kingbird, they do look similar. But you will know when you've seen a giant kingbird once you've seen that bill. Again, even in these photos, it's fairly difficult to get a full understanding of just how different they are, but those bills are drastically different in the field. Moving on from loggerhead kingbird, there's a Cuban vireo. We will probably have seen quite a few of them by this point. Normally keeps a few twigs or leaves between you and it, especially if you're carrying a camera. It's one of the few times that it exposed itself properly. Another reason for being at Nahasa is to find this species, Gundlach's hawk. It's quite often the holy grail of endemics, or at least the viable ones. There's probably about 150 pairs of this bird. It's rare, it's never been common. It's got quite a scattered population. Personally, this was a nemesis bird for me. It took about three tours before I finally found one. And on average, we see it about every 2 out of 3 tours. We also come here to find Cuban parakeet, which is refreshingly common in this area. They, like typical parakeets, like to congregate. You will normally see flocks of about 10 species, 10 birds in a flock. Also threatened by the cage bird trade. It's got to be one of the best looking New World warblers, black-throated blue warbler, lovely male that can be very common around the island. They pitch up from about October and last through to March. We're getting towards the end of the tour now. We're going to head to the Keys in the north of the island to find a few more of the final endemics before we make our way back to Havana. And to get there, we've got to pass over this huge bridge. It's 27 kilometers long that connects the mainland of Cuba to Cayo Coco. We'll stop for a couple of birding spots along the way. There's often a few tidal species to see. It's not very deep water on either side. And we get to the Keys itself. This is the island of Cayo Coco, a typical view of the island. It has these lagoons, mangroves, and lots of tourist facilities. That particular house that I've taken a photo of is my favorite place to look for West Indian whistling duck. It's normally quite reliable and get 2 or 3 individuals under one of these units. We also look for Cuban gnatcatcher, which can be pretty common either in the hotel grounds or just next to the mangroves. They very rarely sit still long enough to get any photo. Like a typical gnatcatcher, they like to move around. The tricky Bahama mockingbird. It's found in the Bahamas, tiny sections of both Cuba and Jamaica. But it's been pushed out of its range in Cuba by the more dominant northern mockingbird. So there's a couple of pairs hanging on in the north of Cuba, which we'll find, hopefully. And the Orient warbler, the other half of the endemic Cuban warbler family. It's again, gorgeous little warbler. That can be quite common up here in the north of the island. We should also see Cuban Amazon by this point, also known as the rose-throated Amazon. Again, need to see the Cayman and the Bahamas subspecies of this bird are sometimes considered a different species, so it's useful to have them all in the bag. Thick-billed vireo, we started to see very regularly on our tours on the island of Cayo Paradom Grande, which is one of only 2 islands in Cuba that the bird is found on. It's common in the Bahamas, but it was only found fairly recently to exist in the north of Cuba. The Cuban blackhawk used to be conspecific with common blackhawk until it was split. It's common on the north of the island and on the south along any coastal stretch, and very confiding. In fact, the one standing behind me when I took this photo on an old iPhone 4 could have been 6 or 7 feet behind me. Wasn't paying any attention to me. They're actually very regularly seen in the coastal resorts in this area of Cayo Coco, particularly where the chefs feed them occasionally next to the swimming pools. And we'll see Cuban oriole by this point as well. It's one of a 4-way split of what used to be the greater Antillean oriole. And for some of you will recognize this bird easily, piping plover. It was once considered a very rare visitor to Cuba. It's now been found wintering in the northern Keys in small numbers at least. And one of the final key species that we'll be looking for is this, the Key West quail dove. Believe it or not, this bird was described from Key West in Florida. I don't know how many records you see in the US of this bird every year, but probably not many. And we mostly find them in the north here at small water features around the Keys. Fresh water is very scarce, as it happens on these islands. And then after enjoying ourselves in the northern Keys, we'll start making our way back to Havana. We might stop a few times on the way if we still need any birds, but generally speaking, we just make our way back to Havana. The 3 birds I've been avoiding until this point: Cuban kite. On the left is a drawing by Nils Navarro. Zapata rail by Alan Brooks, painting there. And the last known photo of Cuban ivory-billed woodpecker on the right by John Dennis. Why have I avoided these to now? Well, you've got no hope in hell of seeing these, I'm afraid. Cuban kite has been seen a few times in the last decade, and only in the Alejandro de Humboldt National Park, which is very near to Guantanamo Bay. Zapata rail, despite claims to the contrary by some birders, has only been recorded reliably once in the last decade, and that was by BirdLife research team in 2014. And the Cuban ivory-billed woodpecker, and I stress that the Cuban, also known as the royal woodpecker, was last seen in 1987. The area was immediately protected by the Cuban government, but despite many searches, it has never been recorded since. And why I stressed Cuban is that DNA now suggests that the Cuban and US populations were in fact separate species. So that rules out any chances you have of seeing ivory-billed woodpecker, at least the US population, I would think. Now, Cuba is the quintessential Caribbean beach paradise as well, but we don't spend a huge amount of time out on the beaches or drinking from coconuts. It's certainly something that you could well plan after the birding tour. Do keep in mind that all residents of the United States are not allowed to look at the beach or stand on it. Tourism is not permitted. A couple more images that you're likely to see while traveling around these islands, especially if you go to places like the tourist areas of Varadero. It's interesting to note that there's no streets, buildings, or institutions that are named after Castro, so finding any image of him can be quite challenging. Che Guevara, on the other hand, is everywhere, as is Jose Marti, the statue on the right. And some of the great aspects of what Cuba has produced: stunning rum, some excellent cigars, and the tourist favorites, Cuban number plates. The rum and cigars are of extraordinary quality, at least for my palate. They're not as cheap as they used to be. It is something that I think, despite being allowed to take small portions of these back to the United States, it would probably not be in your best interest to do so. customs regularly confiscates them regardless of whether they're legal or not. Something I'm getting used to, our lockdown in South Africa right now is preventing us from buying alcohol or smoking cigarettes or cigars, so we know what it's like to have this prohibition. And folks, with that, we get back on our planes and depart Cuba, hopefully having seen all the endemics and had a wonderful time. I would like to say thank you to my colleagues Adam, Dushan and Forrest for a number of the photos that I used in here. There were a few other photos that I made use of where I specified who took the images in the sliders themselves. And that is all from me. Thank you very much for listening.
That was great. Thank you so much, Clayton. And I've got a whole bunch of questions, and we've got some time to go through it. So really great questions. Thank you so much. And if you do have anything, do send us. The first one is, do we conduct legal tours for US citizens going to Cuba? And would there be any special entry exit procedures or paperwork for US citizens that they have to follow in order to go on a Rockjumper Cuba tour?
We do. Earlier this year, we actually changed all of our tours from, we used to have a split between the regular tours, which anyone in the world could just pitch up for, and we had specific US legal tours. Nowadays, we've combined them both into the same tour. All of our tours to Cuba are legal. Yeah. Yes, there is a little bit of extra paperwork and some understanding that it needs to be done before you can go to Cuba legally. But I don't necessarily want to get into too much detail on the webinar because it might take a little time. I have laid this out in our itineraries in good detail. But what I would say is it's fairly simple. It doesn't require a huge amount of extra effort from a paperwork side of things. It only revolves around the acquisition of a visa before you pitch up in Cuba and one or two bits of record keeping that you have to do after your tour.
Oh, awesome, thanks. And what are accommodations like on the tour?
I'll answer that in two parts. When we conducted the, let's say, non-legal US tours, we used to stay at these large hotel complexes that were part owned by the Cuban governments and part owned by international chains. And depending on where you stayed, the quality of accommodation could be iffy, let's put it that way. Not great. The food wasn't particularly fantastic. The quality of service was fairly poor. In order to be compliant with legal US requirements to visit the island, we must not use or support any Cuban government or military owned or invested institution, which means that we must use private facilities, and private facilities are far better. The quality of accommodation is much better. It's not a hotel room. You know, this is someone's house that you're going to stay in. So normally we stay in what's known as a hospedage. There's 5 or 6 rooms that Cuban entrepreneurs have built themselves. They have much better food and facilities, and of course the service is spectacular by comparison. So much better than it used to be.
And this is a two-part question. Can US citizens fly directly to Cuba? And is there an extra cost for American citizens to bird there?
No. Yes, you can fly direct from the United States to Cuba. There used to be far more airports that you could land at. The last changes to the embargo by the current US administration removed most of the access points to Cuba, but you are still comfortably able to fly into Havana. And there's no supplementary action or requirements on US citizens in terms of expense or cost to be in Cuba at all.
Great. There was a question that came in. What mammals have you seen?
Yeah. I think brown rat is about the only mammal that I've seen in Cuba. There are a few mammals, but like Cuban solenodon, but those are incredibly scarce, rare. Yeah. Unless you mount a specific expedition, you're not going to see any of them.
Oh, Great. Yeah, and then what is the best time of the year to see and photograph adult male bee hummingbirds?
Look, the time of year that we visit Cuba, we try to keep our time frames tight between late December or late November through till mid-March. And bee hummingbirds can be photographed. I think the shot that Dushan took there was towards the middle of February. But this is the breeding season for them is variable. The best images that I've ever had of that bird tend to be mid-February through to early March.
And then Ed says, I might have missed it, but what is the total number of birds in Cuba?
I didn't miss it. I didn't say as much. I don't know, to be perfectly honest. I think the Cuban national list must be just over 300 or so. Probably a little bit more. The record bird number of species that we've seen on a tour is, I think Forrest might, or Dushan holds that record now. It's about 170.
And is Cuba safe to travel to?
Cuba's probably the safest country on the planet. There's next to no such thing as violent crime in the country. Probably until about 20 years ago, when tourists started really picking up in Cuba, even petty crime was unheard of. If anyone was in jail in Cuba, it was because they disagreed with the politics of the country. It had nothing to do with anything else. So violent crime is, I don't know of any instances. Never heard of any of that. There has been an increase in petty crime, and certainly there's been an increase in, I'd say, hustling, if you like, trying to sell black market cigars. There's now, prostitution has crept in, and this has all come about, since tourism has started in the country.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, it's, I would be quite happy to walk through the center of Havana at any time of day or night and not worry about any impact or safety of my life at all.
Do any of our tour dates overlap with the Cuban martin, when Cuban martin is present?
Yeah, Cuban martins are present from about January through to March that we know of. So the December tours tend not to get Cuban martin. If you want to get Cuban martin, generally the January onwards to about March. It's still classified as an endemic, but we're absolutely certain that bird is not endemic. It goes somewhere. It's theorized that it goes to Venezuela, but no one knows for sure.
Great.
Definitely in Cuba, yes, January, February, March.
Yeah, and I popped in all the dates into your chat as well. So all the different dates that we run tours, you'll find them in your chat box there. Let's see. Have you seen the famous jumping crocodiles?
No. Where we go through Boca de Guama, they do have a big crocodile farm there, which is part of the Cuban crocodile reintroduction program. But to see legitimate Cuban crocodiles, you need to actually go on a fairly long boat ride out of that area, deeper into the Zapata swamp to find them. Oh. The Zapata swamp, unfortunately, has been decimated by catfish. They're an African species which have riddled the swamp. It's probably why Zapata rail is, if it isn't extinct, it's very close to being extinct, because those catfish eat everything that moves.
Wow. Wow.
And they were introduced to Cuba after a hurricane.
Yeah, sure. When here's a question from Peter. To what extent is there contact with Cubans other than the lodging hosts? Do you stop at the botanical gardens in Trinidad?
We don't go to Trinidad at present, although that is on the cards for the future. In terms of interaction with Cubans, we have 5 or 6 local guides, because we use site guides at every area rather than one specific local guide for the entire tour. Definitely now that we're using the private hospedagis, we have interaction with all the people that own the house and the restaurants. We generally have quite a bit of interaction, and certainly if you spend any amount of time in Havana itself, outside of the tour, you have as much interaction as you wish.
Oh, thanks, Clayton. And this is the last question for this evening, because I see we've run out of time. What is the preferred age of participants on our tours, and what age are the oldest guests and you have entertained on a tour, and as well as the Papua New Guinea one that we did last week? Just a general query from Cheryl on our age group.
Well, let me answer it backwards. I did have a tour of Cuba, which, with permission, I think we called it the Golden Girls tour. There were 8 guests on the tour with me, 7 ladies, most of whom were well over 80. I think the oldest lady on the tour was about 88. So yeah, Cuba's very easy. It doesn't matter how old you are. I think Cuba's easily done. There's not a whole lot of early mornings. There's not a whole lot of late nights. The majority of Cuba is flat as a pancake, so it's easy to get around. Papua New Guinea is a little bit different. Papua New Guinea certainly helps to be a little bit fit. So I'm not going to put an age on that, because I've seen very old people put people my age to shame, fitness-wise. So it really is about fitness as opposed to age.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, thank you. Thanks. That's everything on the Q&A. Over to you, Keith.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much, Clayton, and thanks so much, Nikki, as well. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for those interesting questions as well. But yeah, just a fantastic presentation, Clayton. Yeah, thanks so much for that. So yeah, kickstarting the month of August, we'll be featuring Zambia. Yeah, it's a country that largely flies under the radar, I think, for many world birders and travelers. Most people know it's somewhere tucked in Africa, but yeah, exactly where, not everyone is sure. One of those that a lot of world birders just haven't heard about or haven't traveled to. So yeah, it's a fascinating place though, and it does hold a plethora of special and localized species, including some of the most iconic birds in the world, such as shoebill and African pitta. It also holds numerous species of Miombo specials. So these are birds that are only found in sort of this broadleaf type woodland habitat, which largely occurs across Zambia, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Angola in a small band. And yeah, there's also lots of other interesting locations as well and landmarks, including Victoria Falls, the massive Banguela swamps, and some of Africa's most famous national parks as well, such as Kafue, the Lower Zambezi, and South Luangwa, which is very famous for its high density of leopards and also African wild dog as well. Yeah, I've got a lot of great classic big game there too. So yeah, I invite you guys to all join Daniel Dunkvet's next week, where he's going to be taking us on a journey through his home country of Zambia. And yeah, I'm sure you'll get to learn a lot about this often overlooked birding and wildlife destination. Also, just a reminder that the webinars are recorded and can be reviewed or viewed later, should I say. And those links will be available within the next 24 to 48 hours. So look out for those. And then, yeah, the webinars are all being offered free of charge as well. But should you wish to donate towards our tour leaders, our GoFundMe link is still open, and 100% of the proceeds go directly to the guides. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again next week, Wednesday, at the same time. From all of us, that's Clayton, Nikki, myself, and everyone else at Team Rockjumper, thank you so much, and goodbye.
Bye.